Hello, thank you for attending my talk on well-being and capabilities of collectives. My name is Peter Koch. I'm an assistant professor at Villanova University near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States. So the question that I wish to address today is how might we understand the well-being of collectives? And so the process by which I'm going to address this question is to first talk a bit about how we talk about the well-being of individuals, how we understand the well-being of individuals, specifically drawing upon the capabilities approach, which uses the notion of capability as foundational to understanding the well-being of individuals. Then I'm going to use basic formal ontology to further refine our understanding of capability so that it reflects a notion that can be applied to collectives rather than just individuals. And then I'm going to reconstruct an account of well-being of collectives, or at least propose a reconstruction using this term capability. So we can start with the well-being of individuals. And when I talk about well-being, I am not talking about mere happiness or contentment or other attitudinal states that might be reflected in theories such as hedonism, which says that an individual's well-being is understood best by the amount of pleasure or pain that they endure across a lifetime. But rather, I'm going to turn to a capabilities approach, which has seen quite a bit of exposure over the last 30 or 40 years, particularly in the work of Sen and Nussbaum. And Sen and Nussbaum argue that, here's a quote from Nussbaum, that capabilities are the answers to the question, what is this person able to do or be? Or what Sen calls substantial freedoms. They're the opportunities to choose and act. So usually these are applied to individuals. So if we're looking at how well an individual fares, we should talk about not only what they're doing, but what they're able to do. And the question of what a person is doing as opposed to what they're able to do is the question of, following the capabilities approach, what we call functioning. So this is the bottom point here. Functionings are your beings and doings, the realizations of capabilities. And so capability and functioning together form the metrics of well-being. The question that I wish to address here is, how might we understand and so assess the well-being of collectives? And this in part hinges upon how we understand the capabilities of collectives if we draw upon the capabilities approach. So towards that end, we can first define a collective entity as a group whose members engage in coordinated activity motivated by a shared interest in a goal or goals. And so some examples of collective entities might be a company, a nation, a club, a profession, a beehive. And then we can talk about how well or poorly these things fare, which is well-being. So I use welfare and well-being interchangeably. We can talk about the well-being of a company across time, across the year. And I think that importantly, the question of how well or poorly a company fares is not reducible to the aggregate or average well-being of the constituents of the collective or the company. So if we did a survey of the well-being of all the employees of a company, that wouldn't reflect necessarily the well-being or the faring of the company as a whole. So when I talk about how's the company faring, I'm talking about something other than the constituents. And the same goes for a nation, a club, a profession, or a beehive. The well-being of each doesn't necessarily reflect or imply, the level of well-being of each doesn't necessarily reflect or imply the level of well-being of the whole. So the approach that I would like to take is to revisit the notion of capability and hammer out a more sort of robust notion that can be applied to collectives. And the method to hammer out this more robust notion is to draw upon an ontology called basic formal ontology, which has grown recognition and use in many different disciplines and fields. And so use the terms and notions that are offered by basic formal ontology to try to figure out what we mean or how we should use the term capability and how this applies to collectives. Seeing as the term capability is so often used for individuals when we talk about the capabilities approach, and capabilities as a notion being able to tell us something about well-being. So basic formal ontology, or BFO, is an upper level ontology that divides all entities into either continuance or occurrence. I'm not going to give a very detailed overview of BFO entities, but this will just give a little bit of background into how I'm situating the term capability. So entities are divided into continuance or occurrence, where continuance are when they exist at all, they exist fully, whereas occurrence unfold across time. For example, processes and events have a beginning, middle, and end. And then continuance, for example, can be independent continuance, such as a cat or an apple. And then specifically dependent continuance are what we often call properties of things. So a cat can be a certain color, and an apple can have a certain flavor, and the cat and the apple are the independent continuant, and those two properties are specifically dependent continuants. And then specifically dependent continuants can be qualities or realizable entities which are what we are concerned with here as far as where capabilities are going to fit eventually. So here's kind of the path that we're going to follow in order to situate capabilities. Again, there's if I can provide the literature overviews of basic formal ontology, but that gives a little overview of what sort of things we're looking at. So one important entity in BFO that can cast some light onto what we mean by capability is a realizable entity. BFO defines a realizable entity as a specifically dependent continuant that has at least one independent continuant as its bearer, and whose instances can be realized in associated processes of specific correlated types in which the bearer participates. So dispositions and roles are the two kinds of realizable entities recognized by BFO. And dispositions are realizable entities that inhere in a bearer, and their existence depends upon the makeup of the bearer. So becoming tan is a realizable entity and a disposition which inheres in you, the bearer. So when you go to the beach, this becoming tan disposition is realized, and you now have this tanness to you. Even in the middle of winter, you have this disposition. Its existence depends upon your makeup, but its realization may very well depend on changes in changes in triggers or whatever causes the manifestation or realization of the disposition, for example, going under the sun. So capabilities then are understood as types of dispositions. They have a special feature to them. So what makes capability a special type of disposition? Well, a capability is a disposition in whose realization an individual or collective entity has an interest. And these individuals are often organisms, and collectives may be composed of organisms, and organisms might be persons or other things. But this leaves it open to many different things that could be individual entities and then collectives as well, using our earlier understanding of collective. So a disposition, as we saw in the previous slides, is a realizable entity whose existence depends on the makeup of the bearer, which distinguishes it from a role. And so we could imagine, for example, there's an abandoned island and there's a sharp rock on this abandoned island. So this rock, in virtue of the shape that it has the disposition to cut coconuts. It has the right strength, etc. in its material. And it has the right shape. But there's no one who's on this island. No one has any interest in this. But imagine you're shipwrecked and you have an interest in opening a coconut. And now you see this sharp rock. So now you can refer to this rock as having the capability to cut and open coconuts. So the feature of having an interest in is a differentiating feature of a capability as a special disposition in whose realization an individual or collective entity has an interest. We've seen that capabilities are special dispositions that some entity has an interest in the realization of. And the relation of interest in is taken as a primitive, but we recognize two different ways in which we can talk about interest in. And this distinction generally falls in, first, an interest in the realization of functions, where functions are either designed purposes, as in the case of artifacts, or in biological purposes or functions, in the sense of, if you give a sort of evolutionary story of how different parts of organisms, organs, came to be, then whatever these parts contribute to the organism as a whole, these are functions. So with the first kind, a knife is designed for cutting well. It's an artifact that's made by persons, and since it has this design, there's an implied interest in this design performing well, and so you have an interest for artifacts in their function. You also have an interest in, independently of a psychological interest in, you as an organism have an interest in your parts functioning, your parts realizing their functions well. You have a heart, and you as an organism have an interest in your heart realizing its function or disposition of pumping blood well. So that's interesting in this first sense, two different ways, independent of whether or not someone psychologically has an interest in something. And a mouse, for example, has an interest in its heart pumping blood, even though it might not have any desire for its heart to pump blood in a kind of robust, conscious way. On the other hand, we can talk about interest in the sort of more colloquial way. If I have an interest in going to a party, or an interest in my sisters and brothers having good lives, or my children faring well, then this is an interest in a sort of the psychological desire sense. And so we take it that a disposition in which an entity has an interest by any of these modes, A or B, then that is now a capability. So collectives with interest in, or collectives with dispositions that an entity has an interest in. So interestingly, by the nature of what a collective is, we can find dispositions that are capabilities pretty quickly. So recall that a group whose members engage in coordinated activity, motivated by a shared interest in a goal or goals, is a collective. So a collective, by definition, has a shared interest in the goal by virtue of which it is a collective. So those dispositions that, when realized, help achieve this goal are collective capabilities. So dispositions that help fulfill that shared interest, that create a collective in the first place, those dispositions are collective capabilities using the definition of capability constructed around notions offered by basic formal ontology. So some capabilities of collectives are, as we saw, those dispositions which, when realized, contribute to the achievement of the collective's shared goal or the realization of the collective's shared goal. A beehive's disposition to communicate is a capability because it helps to protect the queen. However, other capabilities could be capabilities in virtue of that second sense of interest in, which that psychological desire interest in feature is added in. So imagine an introvert person purchases a beehive to deter visitors. So the beehive, in virtue of a whole bunch of dispositions that a beehive has, which is including a large swath of organisms that can hurt you, these dispositions then become capabilities to deter visitors. In this case, because there's this interest in another source. So you could have capabilities which are geared towards the sort of biological or organic goal of certain collectives, but also capabilities that are products of an external interest in the activities of a collective. So here is an example of collective well-being using a capability as we've understood it up to this point, capability constructed upon notions that we found in BFO. So you can imagine a small company, which we'll understand as a collective designed to make profit. Of course, many companies perhaps weren't founded for this purpose, but a company in general, in the structure that we'll use here, is a collective designed to make profit. And say it's poorly equipped in some feature that contributes to its making profit, such as developing new market strategies. If someone were to assess how well or poorly the company is doing, they should and would look at, is the company doing well with respect to marketing? And they would say the company is faring poorly with respect to marketing strategies, with respect to developing market strategies. So we can see this because we have the goal of what makes a company, its sort of end, and then we can see that we can test certain dispositions that it has. How are they realized? If they're not realized well, and here you have some distinctions between the lack of existence of a disposition versus a poorly realized disposition. But if this disposition, which is a capability in virtue of it being the object of interest in virtue of it being what a small company is, we can see that it's faring poorly with respect to this capability. We can look at this capability and say it's faring poorly. And importantly, you can imagine a company that's inherited by somebody who doesn't care about the company, and the employees don't want it to succeed. We could still make the claim that the company is faring poorly because we know what a company is, what it's designed for, what dispositions are directed towards that end, and how it's failing. So to summarize, the question that I wish to address is how we might assess well-being of collectives. We can draw upon the basic framework of the capabilities approach, but refine capability to understand it as a disposition that some entity has an interest in the realization of, and talk about different ways of having an interest in a realization, and then apply this interest in understanding of capability to assessing the welfare of collectives and the welfare of various kinds of collectives, including companies or organic collectives. So thank you very much for joining me in this project.